They wrote it down. The conspiracy was written out on paper. That is rare in criminal prosecutions. Prosecutors are usually left explaining to juries that, criminal conspirators don't write it all down, but that is what they did in the Trump office on Fifth Avenue and in the White House. Today, Donald Trump's jury was shown the handwritten conspiracy to pay back Michael Cohen for paying $130,000 to porn star Stormy Daniels to purchase her silence before the presidential election about what she has since described as one very quick sexual encounter with Donald Trump. Donald Trump's financial mastermind, convicted felon Allen Weisselberg, put the conspiracy in his handwriting on Michael Cohen's bank statement. And then another financial officer in the Trump shop put the whole thing in his handwriting on Trump company stationery. That handwritten description of the conspiracy called for Michael Cohen to be paid $35,000 a month as reimbursement for his payments to Stormy Daniels. And the final handwriting in the conspiracy presented to the jury today were Donald Trump's signatures on those $35,000 checks to Michael Cohen. It didn't really matter much what today's witness, Jeffrey McConney, told the jury, because the handwriting told the story. But Jeffrey McConney did confirm that that is Allen Weisselberg's handwriting on Michael Cohen's bank statement. Question, do you recognize this document? Answer, yes. Question, what is it? Answer, this is the bank statement that Allen gave me to put in the files. Question, is there handwriting on this document? Answer, there are two sets of handwriting on the bottom of the document. Question, do you recognize the handwriting? Answer, I recognize the handwriting on the left side of the page, but not the right side of the page. Question, whose handwriting do you recognize on the left side of the page? Answer, that belongs to Allen Weisselberg. Question, how do you recognize his handwriting? Answer, I've read his handwriting for about 35 years. The writing on the right side of the page is likely to turn out to be Michael Cohen's writing, showing Allen Weisselberg why he was owed $50,000 more than the $130,000 he paid to Stormy Daniels. The $50,000 was for a previous expense that he paid to a firm to rig online polls for Donald Trump. According to Allen Weisselberg's notes, he grossed up the $180,000 to $360,000. Question, what does grossed up mean? Answer, I don't know exactly what it meant, but he probably meant, so for tax purposes, if Michael recorded $360,000 income, he would net, assuming a 50% tax rate, $180,000. To the $360,000, Allen Weisselberg then added in his handwriting an annual bonus of $60,000, bringing the grossed up total to be paid to Michael Cohen to $420,000, which Allen Weisselberg's handwriting says would be paid at $35,000 per month. And then Donald Trump's signed checks to Michael Cohen for $35,000 per month were presented to the jury. On cross-examination, one of Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyers, Emil Bove, asked Jeffrey McConney if he ever spoke to Donald Trump about the scheme. Question, you did not talk to him about those events in 2016, correct? Answer, I did not. You did not talk to him about those events in 2017, did you? Answer, I did not. And you did not talk to him about those events in 2018 either. Answer, I did not. Question, not ever, right? Answer, no. Before any testimony was heard this morning, Judge Juan Merchan once again held Donald Trump in contempt of court for violating the gag order, which forbids Donald Trump from saying anything about the jury in this case. Judge Merchan handed out a 5-page written opinion and order in which he responded to the prosecution's request that Donald Trump be found in contempt for violating the gag order 4 more times. Judge Merchan found only one of those alleged violations of the gag order was proved beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge wrote, defendant violated the order by making public statements about the jury and how it was selected. In doing so, defendant not only called into question the integrity and therefore the legitimacy of these proceedings, but again raised the specter of fear for the safety of the jurors and of their loved ones. Because this is now the 10th time that this court has found defendant in criminal contempt, spanning 3 separate motions, it is apparent that monetary fines have not and will not suffice to deter defendant from violating this court's lawful orders. Therefore, defendant is hereby put on notice that if appropriate and warranted, future violations of its lawful orders will be punishable by incarceration. Not trusting Donald Trump to actually read his order, the judge then spoke directly to Donald Trump when he handed out his written decision, and looking directly at Donald Trump, Judge Merchan said in open court, quote, "Going forward, this court will have to consider a jail sanction if recommended. Mr. Trump, it's important to understand that the last thing I want to do is put you in jail. You are the former president of the United States and possibly the next president as well. There are many reasons why incarceration is truly a last resort for me. To take that step would be disruptive to these proceedings, which I imagine you want to end as quickly as possible. I also worry about the people who would have to execute that sanction, the court officers, the correction officers, the Secret Service detail, among others. I worry about them and about what would go into executing such a sanction. Of course, I'm also aware of the broader implications of such a sanction. The magnitude of such a decision is not one-sided, but at the end of the day, I have a job to do, and part of that job is to protect the dignity of the judicial system and compel respect. Your continued violations of this court's lawful order threaten to interfere with the administration of justice in constant attacks, which constitute a direct attack on the rule of law. I cannot allow that to continue. So as much as I do not want to impose a jail sanction, and I have done everything I can to avoid doing so, I want you to understand that I will, if necessary and appropriate.